Just the facts, though. Don't you worry. New York Times 2012. Big problem with mail-in voting. New York Times 2020. No problem with mail-in voting. Dogs, cats, donkeys, elephants, they don't care. Everybody gets a ballot. Here's a ballot. There's a ballot. Here's a ballot too. Everybody gets one. No possibility for fraud there, no? Well, what's the problem about that? When mail-in voting, i.e. our military folks sending in mail-in ballots, and some of our older folks, was largely a Republican thing, older voters that tend to lean Republican and military folks, the media had a real problem with mail-in voting. They did, because it was a Republican thing. Weird. Wall Street Journal had a great article about how the media just changes their story overnight, depending on if the story benefits the Republicans or Democrats. Remember, facts first, folks. Facts first. Wall Street Journal, Gerard Baker. It takes a super spreader to know a super spreader. The article's about how the media changes their story about these super spreader rallies and riots based on who it is. If it's a riot for the Democrats, it's A-OK. If it's a Trump rally, everybody's going to die. But they also dig into this, how they change the narrative on voting. Check this out. This is fascinating. Voting by mail. Listen to this quote. Listen to this quote. This is clearly a presidential tweet, right, folks? Listen. Voting by mail is now common enough and problematic enough that election experts say there have been multiple elections in which no one can say with confidence which candidate was the deserved winner. Joe, definitely a presidential tweet, right? Or some right-winger? No, that was the New York Times. Sorry, Armacost, didn't mean to set you up there. That was the New York Times talking about the systemic problems with mail-in voting. Quote, try the New York Times. That was a front-page news story published just before the 2012 presidential election. The New York Times cast grave doubt on the reliability of widespread mail-in voting, noting it was much more vulnerable to fraud than conventional voting. Weird. Quote, New York Times, folks, quote, now this is not Trump. While fraud in voting by mail is far less common than innocent errors, it is vastly more prevalent than in-person voting fraud. There we go. Again, New York Times. Big problems with mail-in voting and fraud, folks. Why? Why did the New York Times in 2012 state the obvious that mail-in voting is more susceptible to fraud than in-person voting? Gee, why would they do that? Just the facts, folks. Just the news. Really? No, maybe there was a political motivation behind it. Remember, everything viewed through the New York Times or CNN lenses. Why are they writing this to hurt Republicans and help Democrats? When you start to see through all those stories, everything makes sense. Let's go to screenshot number 2 from the Wall Street Journal piece, and now it all makes sense. Quote, well, times change. Last month, the New York Times ran a headline that said, Trump is pushing a false argument on vote-by-mail fraud. Huh? Same paper, folks. Same paper. They go on. They say, it's possible, I suppose, that all that fraud the paper worried about has just disappeared in 8 years. But the real clue as to why the New York Times, along with virtually the entire media, now claims mail-in fraud is false, comes down in that 2012 election news item. Quote, here's what they said in 2012. Oh, now it's making sense. So now the voter fraud they said is real isn't real anymore. But back in 2012, they said Republicans are in fact more likely than Dems to vote absentee. Oh, in the 2008 general election in Florida, 47% of absentee voters were Republicans, 36% were Democrats. There you have it, folks. Quote, when voting by mail seemed to be a Republican thing, it was fraud, manipulation. Now that Democrats are expected to vote this way by mail in much greater numbers, it's all, don't worry, nothing to see here, folks. Don't worry. That story we wrote in 2012 about mail-in fraud being a really big deal, it's not a big deal now. We only worried about it when Republicans mailed in their votes. Now that Democrats are mailing in votes, we don't want you to call them fraudulent. So all that stuff, memory hole, all that. Memory hole. Memory hole.
You just heard Dan Bongino.